Tuesday morning, 6:47 a.m., and I'm staring at a pregnancy test on my kitchen counter next to divorce papers that were supposed to be final 3 months ago. The test belongs to my wife who walked out for her college boyfriend, and the papers belong to a marriage I thought was already dead. Sometimes life doesn't wait for your signature to complicate everything you thought you understood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I'm the kind of man who reads instruction manuals twice before assembling furniture. I grew up in Portland where rain teaches you patience, and my grandmother taught me that preparation prevents most problems. At 32, I run a small accounting firm, drive a Honda with 180,000 miles that still starts every morning, and keep emergency supplies in my basement because Boy Scouts leave permanent habits. I believe in backup plans for backup plans. When I married Jessica, I thought I was marrying someone who shared that philosophy. We met at a coffee shop where she spilled latte on my tax forms and spent 20 minutes helping me reprint them. She had this laugh that made mistakes feel like invitations to try again. We dated for 2 years, lived together for 1, and got married in her parents' backyard under string lights that took me 3 weekends to hang perfectly. Jessica Williams came from the kind of family that makes Christmas look like a magazine cover. Her mother organized charity galas and her father coached Little League with the enthusiasm of someone who never stopped believing in second chances. Jessica inherited their optimism and their inability to see red flags until they're in the rearview mirror. She worked as a graphic designer for a nonprofit, the type who stayed late to make flyers look just right for causes she believed in. For 3 years we built something that felt solid. Sunday morning pancakes, shared Netflix passwords, arguments about thermostats that ended in compromise. I handled our finances with spreadsheets that tracked every expense down to the coffee we bought on date nights. Jessica handled the social calendar with color-coded planning that turned our refrigerator into mission control for a life that looked successful from the outside. The foundation started showing cracks around our second anniversary. Small things first. Jessica would mention names from her past with the kind of fondness that made me look up from whatever I was reading. She started working later, coming home with stories about colleagues I'd never met and events I wasn't invited to. When I suggested we update our will and life insurance policies, she said it felt too morbid for people our age. That should have been my first real warning. Adults who avoid paperwork usually have something to hide or something to lose. But love makes you optimistic about things that would send your accountant brain running for calculators. I told myself marriages go through seasons, that we were just in a stretch where work demanded more attention than each other. The real shift happened when her college reunion approached. Jessica had attended State University, where she'd dated someone named Marcus for most of her junior and senior years. She'd mentioned him before in passing, the way you mention weather that happened last week. But as the reunion got closer, his name started appearing in conversations with the frequency of someone who was taking up more space in her thoughts than seemed appropriate for ancient history. Marcus had been her first serious relationship, the one that taught her what it felt like to plan a future with someone. They'd broken up because of geography, when graduate schools pulled them to different coasts, the kind of ending that leaves questions instead of answers, timing instead of closure. I've learned that timing breakups are the dangerous ones. They leave people wondering what if instead of knowing why not. Jessica started mentioning him with details that seemed too fresh for someone she hadn't spoken to in years. How he'd started his own marketing company in Denver. How he'd never married despite coming close twice. How he'd sent her a message through the reunion website asking if she planned to attend. These updates came during dinner conversations with the casual tone people use for weather reports, but weather doesn't make your spouse check their phone with the anticipation of someone expecting important news. I suggested going with her to the reunion. She said it would be boring for me since I didn't know anyone. I offered to stay home and handle some projects around the house. She said that sounded perfect and kissed my cheek with the kind of gratitude that felt like relief. When someone is grateful that you're not coming along, you're usually right to wonder where they're actually going. The reunion was a 3-day weekend in Seattle. Jessica packed with the care of someone preparing for a job interview, trying on outfits and asking my opinion about dresses I'd never seen her wear. She'd bought new clothes for the occasion, which wasn't unusual, except that she asked me to stay out of the bedroom while she packed, which was. I've always believed that trust is like a bank account. Small deposits over time build something substantial, but large withdrawals can empty it faster than you think. Watching Jessica prepare for a weekend that seemed to matter more than our recent anniversary made me check our balance and realize we'd been making more withdrawals than deposits for months. She left on a Friday morning with a suitcase that looked like she was moving out instead of visiting old friends. I kissed her goodbye in our driveway and watched her drive away with the distinct feeling that something was ending that we hadn't discussed. That weekend, I organized our home office, updated our household budget, and called my brother just to hear a familiar voice that wasn't Carol. Jessica came back Sunday night different. Not dramatically, but in the way that milk turns when you're not paying attention. Same container, different contents. She was distant but cheerful, distracted but apologetic about being distracted. She unpacked quickly and did laundry immediately, as if removing evidence of where she'd been and who she'd seen. Over the next few weeks, her phone became a constant companion in ways it had never been before. Text messages that made her smile in the middle of serious conversations. Late-night calls she took in the garage under the pretense of not waking me. When I asked who kept reaching out so frequently, she mentioned a few college friends who were planning another get-together soon. I'm not naturally suspicious, but I am naturally thorough. When details don't add up, I notice. When patterns change without explanation, I pay attention. Jessica's patterns were changing in ways that felt intentional rather than organic. She started working late more often, accepting weekend projects that required travel, and suggesting that I make plans with my own friends instead of waiting around for her. The conversation I'd been avoiding came on a Thursday night in October. I'd made dinner, set the table with candles, and opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. Sometimes you create special occasions because regular ones aren't working anymore. Jessica sat across from me, checking her phone between bites, and I realized we were roommates who happened to be married rather than partners who happened to live together. I asked her directly if everything was okay with us. She said yes, but yes came too quickly and without eye contact. I asked if there was someone else. She said no, but no came with a pause that felt like she was checking her answer against something she'd rehearsed. I set down my fork and told her I deserved honesty, even if it wasn't easy to give. That's when she told me about Marcus, how they'd reconnected at the reunion, how they'd spent hours talking about the life they'd imagined together before geography separated them, how those conversations had continued through texts and calls that made her realize what she might have missed by settling down so young. She used the word settling like it explained everything and apologized for nothing. I asked if she wanted to work on our marriage.
Yeah.
She said she needed time to figure out what she wanted. I told her that time wasn't something she could take while living in limbo with me. She needed to choose, and she needed to choose soon because uncertainty wasn't fair to either of us. We agreed on a trial separation, which is marriage's way of saying divorce with training wheels. Jessica moved into a furnished apartment across town, taking enough belongings to look temporary but leaving enough behind to keep her options open. We divided household expenses and agreed to talk once a week to discuss logistics. For the first month, those conversations were civil and brief. She was doing well, exploring what independence felt like, taking time to think about what she really.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
By the second month, Marcus's name had migrated from occasional mentions to the center of most sentences. He was planning to visit Portland for business. She might visit him in Denver for a long weekend. They were exploring whether what they'd felt in college could work in their 30s. She spoke about him with the kind of excitement she used to reserve for vacation plans and career opportunities. I realized she wasn't taking time to think about our marriage. She was taking time to start a new relationship without the inconvenience of officially ending the old one. When someone asks for space but fills it with someone else, they're not confused about what they want. They're shopping for something better while keeping their current option warm. The final conversation happened on a cold February morning. Jessica called to tell me she was flying to Denver to spend a week with Marcus, and when she came back she wanted to discuss making our separation permanent. She'd found what she was looking for and it wasn't what we'd built together. She thanked me for being understanding and patient, as if patience was a favor I'd done her rather than an investment I'd made in us. I told her I'd start the divorce paperwork and suggested we handle it through mediation rather than lawyers if possible. She agreed, relieved that I wasn't going to make it difficult. She promised to collect the rest of her belongings when she returned from Denver, and we could sit down to divide assets and finalize everything like adults who'd simply grown apart. That night I sat in our house that was now just my house and made a decision that would save me months of heartache. I called a locksmith for the next morning. Then I called my attorney to discuss expediting our divorce proceedings. If Jessica wanted to explore her options, she could do it without using our home as a backup plan. People who've never been through divorce think it's about anger and revenge. Sometimes it is, but more often it's about establishing boundaries when someone has shown they can't respect the ones you already had. Jessica had spent months treating our marriage like a safety net while she tested other possibilities. I decided to remove the net and let her learn to fly or fall on her own. The locksmith came early Saturday morning. I changed the locks on all exterior doors, installed a new deadbolt on the front door, and updated the security system to remove Jessica's access codes. I wasn't being vindictive. I was being practical. The house was in my name, purchased before our marriage with money I'd saved since college. Jessica had never contributed to the mortgage or property taxes, though she'd enjoyed the benefits of homeownership without the responsibilities. I called the utility companies to remove her name from accounts she'd never paid. I updated our bank information to separate our finances cleanly. I contacted our insurance providers to discuss changes in beneficiaries and coverage. Divorce is a logistical nightmare disguised as an emotional crisis, and I've always been better with logistics than emotions. I packaged Jessica's remaining belongings carefully, making inventory lists and taking photos of everything before sealing the boxes. I wasn't trying to hold her possessions hostage. I was documenting our separation thoroughly because clean breaks require clear evidence. I scheduled a storage unit in her name and arranged for her boxes to be moved there, along with furniture she'd brought into our marriage. The divorce papers were filed the following Monday. In Oregon there's a waiting period, but our case was straightforward enough to move through the system efficiently. We had a prenuptial agreement that protected my premarital assets, and Jessica had agreed to its terms without argument when we'd married. She'd been eager to sign anything that moved us toward the wedding she'd been planning since high school. Our mediation session was scheduled for the first week of March. Jessica returned from Denver with a tan and an engagement ring, which explained why she'd been so agreeable about the divorce timeline. Marcus had proposed during her visit, and they were planning a summer wedding in Colorado. She seemed surprised that our paperwork was already in motion, as if she'd expected me to wait indefinitely for her to finish exploring her options. The mediation went smoothly because there wasn't much to divide. The house was mine, the savings accounts were separate, and Jessica's student loans remained her responsibility. She kept her car, her retirement account, and the furniture I'd moved to storage. We split wedding gifts down the middle and agreed she could keep her engagement ring and wedding band. She seemed relieved that I wasn't demanding alimony or making emotional appeals for reconciliation. The divorce was finalized in early April, almost exactly 1 year after Jessica had left for her college reunion. She moved to Denver 2 weeks later, posting photos on social media of her new apartment and her upcoming wedding plans. I was tagged in exactly 0 of these updates, which suited me perfectly. Some chapters are better left closed without footnotes. I thought the story was over. I was wrong. The phone call came on a humid Tuesday morning in July. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed with Jessica's name for the first time since our divorce papers had been signed. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won over caution. She sounded different, smaller somehow, with none of the confidence that had carried her through our divorce proceedings. She asked if we could talk, and when I asked about what, she said it was complicated and she'd rather explain in person. I told her I was busy and she could explain over the phone or not at all. That's when she told me she was pregnant and back in Portland, and needed to discuss something important about our divorce. My first thought was congratulations, followed immediately by confusion about why this news required a conversation with me. Our marriage was over, our divorce was final, and her pregnancy with her new husband wasn't my business or my responsibility. I told her exactly that, with the polite distance of someone who'd learned not to get pulled back into chaos that wasn't his to solve. She started crying, which Jessica had always done when conversations weren't going the way she'd planned. Between sobs, she managed to explain that her engagement to Marcus had ended badly, that she'd moved back to Portland because she had nowhere else to go, and that she needed help figuring out her next steps. She asked if she could come over so we could talk face to face about her situation. I told her no, not angrily, but firmly. Our house was no longer a place she could visit when life got complicated. If she wanted to talk, we could meet at a coffee shop like the adults we were supposed to be. She agreed reluctantly, and we arranged to meet the next afternoon at a place downtown that served good coffee and had enough ambient noise to keep private conversations private. I spent that evening wondering what Jessica really wanted and preparing for possibilities I hoped wouldn't materialize. People don't usually call ex-spouses for help unless family and friends have already said no. Jessica's parents lived in Portland, she had siblings in the area, and she'd maintained friendships from college and work. If she was calling me, it meant she'd exhausted other options, or needed something those options couldn't provide. The coffee shop meeting confirmed my suspicions. Jessica looked like someone who'd been living in her car, which it turned out she had been for the past week. Her engagement had ended when Marcus discovered she'd been in contact with another ex-boyfriend from college, someone she'd reached out to when her relationship with Marcus started showing strain. Apparently Jessica's pattern of keeping backup plans extended beyond our marriage. Marcus had asked her to leave immediately, keeping the apartment they'd shared and the wedding deposits they'd made. Jessica had driven back to Portland with whatever fit in her car, planning to stay with her parents until she figured out her next steps. That plan had lasted 3 days before her mother had suggested she find somewhere else to land, while she got her life together. Jessica was 4 months pregnant, unemployed and essentially homeless. She'd burned bridges with Marcus, strained relationships with her family, and discovered that friends are less sympathetic to chaos when it becomes a pattern, rather than an exception. She'd called me because I was the only person in her life who'd never refused to help her, even when helping her wasn't in my best interest. She asked if she could stay in her old house temporarily, just until she found work and could afford her own place. She promised it would only be a few weeks, maybe a month at most. She'd sleep in the guest room, contribute to household expenses, and respect any boundaries I wanted to establish. She spoke as if our divorce was a minor administrative error that could be overlooked in emergency situations. I finished my coffee and told her no. Not because I wanted to see her struggle, but because helping her now would mean becoming responsible for consequences that weren't mine to manage. Jessica had made choices that led to her current situation, and those choices had excluded me from consideration until she needed a safety net. I wasn't interested in being someone's last resort. She asked where she was supposed to go. I suggested her parents, her siblings, friends from work, or any of the social services available to help people in her situation. I wasn't responsible for solving problems she'd created while building a life that deliberately didn't include me. Our divorce had been final for months, and finality meant exactly that. Jessica became angry then, reminding me of the vows we'd made and the commitment we'd promised each other. I reminded her that she'd broken those vows when she'd left for another man, and that commitment works both ways. She couldn't discard our marriage when it was convenient and then invoke it when she needed help. That wasn't how adult relationships worked. I left the coffee shop feeling sorry for Jessica but confident in my decision. Compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice, and helping someone who'd repeatedly chosen others over you isn't kindness. It's enabling behavior that hurts everyone involved. Jessica needed to learn that actions have consequences and that other people aren't obligated to cushion those consequences indefinitely. 2 days later, Jessica called again. This time she was at the emergency room, having experienced what she thought might be pregnancy complications. She was alone, scared, and asking if I could come sit with her while she waited for test results. Everything was probably fine, but she didn't want to be by herself in case it wasn't. I almost said yes. Almost drove to the hospital to sit in a waiting room and hold the hand of someone who'd once been the most important person in my life. But I caught myself before compassion turned into liability. Jessica wasn't my responsibility anymore, and pregnancy emergencies weren't emergencies I was equipped to handle or obligated to share. I told her to call her family or friends and that I hoped everything turned out well for her and the baby. She accused me of being cold and heartless, abandoning someone who'd loved me when she needed help the most. I told her that love was something she'd abandoned when she'd moved to Denver for another man, and that needing help didn't automatically make that help my responsibility. The test results were fine. Jessica updated me via text the next morning, adding that she was disappointed in the kind of man I'd turned out to be. I didn't respond. People who create their own emergencies often blame others when help doesn't arrive on schedule. Jessica had spent a year building a life that didn't include me. She couldn't reasonably expect me to pause my life when hers fell apart. A week passed without contact, which I hoped meant Jessica had found alternative solutions to her housing and employment problems. I was wrong again. She appeared on my doorstep Thursday evening, 8 months pregnant and carrying a suitcase that suggested she'd moved beyond asking for permission. She'd tried the key first, she explained, and seemed genuinely surprised that it didn't work. She hadn't been aware that I'd changed the locks, though she couldn't explain why she'd thought she'd still have access to a house she'd left voluntarily almost a year earlier. She asked if I was really going to make a pregnant woman stand on the porch while we discussed her housing crisis. I told her that her pregnancy wasn't my crisis to solve and that showing up uninvited didn't create an obligation for me to let her in. I suggested she call her family, check into a hotel, or contact social services about emergency housing assistance. Her pregnancy complications were between her and her doctor, not between her and me. Jessica started crying again, asking how I could be so cruel to someone who'd shared my life for 3 years. I reminded her that she'd chosen to stop sharing my life when she'd moved to Denver for another man. That choice had consequences, and those consequences belonged to her, not to me. I wasn't being cruel, I was being clear about boundaries she'd chosen to cross. She asked if she could at least use the bathroom and get a glass of water before figuring out where to go next. I told her there was a gas station 3 blocks away that had public restrooms and bottled water for sale. She accused me of treating her worse than a stranger, and I pointed out that strangers don't usually expect to move into your house without permission. The conversation ended when I closed the door and went back to the kitchen where my dinner was getting cold. Jessica sat on my porch for another 20 minutes, making phone calls that apparently didn't result in alternative accommodations. Eventually, she gathered her suitcase and walked back to her car, which she'd parked in my driveway as if she still lived there. I watched through the window as she drove away, feeling sad for the person she'd become but confident that letting her in would have been a mistake that cost both of us more than it helped either of us. Jessica's problems were real and serious, but they weren't problems that required my participation to solve. She called later that night from a motel, asking one more time if I'd reconsider letting her stay temporarily. She promised to find work quickly, contribute to expenses, and move out as soon as she was financially stable. She spoke as if our divorce was a technicality that shouldn't prevent us from helping each other during difficult times. I told her that our divorce was a legal reality that had ended my obligation to provide her with housing, emotional support, or financial assistance. She'd chosen to pursue other relationships while we were married, and those choices had led to natural consequences she now needed to manage independently. I wished her well and suggested she focus on building relationships with people who weren't her ex-husband. The final conversation happened when Jessica called to tell me she'd found a job at a local nonprofit and was getting back on her feet. She thanked me for forcing her to become independent and admitted that relying on me would have delayed her learning to solve her own problems. She'd given birth to a healthy daughter and was building a life that didn't depend on other people's charity or obligation. She apologized for the way our marriage had ended and for expecting me to help her when her other relationships had failed. She recognized that divorce meant the end of spousal responsibilities, not just marital privilege. She'd learned to distinguish between wanting help and needing help, and to ask for assistance from people who were actually equipped and willing to provide it. I wished her well and meant it. Jessica deserved happiness and stability, just not at my expense or through my participation. Her daughter deserved a mother who could solve problems independently rather than depending on others to manage consequences of her choices. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their dependence on you. Looking back, changing those locks was the smartest decision I made during our entire relationship. It established a boundary that protected both of us from making mistakes that would have damaged us further. Jessica learned to stand on her own feet because standing in my house wasn't an option. I learned that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice and that helping someone sometimes means refusing to help them. The house is quiet now in ways it never was when Jessica lived here. There's no underlying tension about unspoken expectations or unresolved conflicts, no phone calls from other men or tearful conversations about needing space to figure things out. No pregnancy tests on kitchen counters next to divorce papers from marriages that should have ended sooner. I've started dating again, slowly and carefully. Women who are available rather than confused, single rather than separated, interested in building something new rather than escaping something old. People who understand that relationships require participation from both people and that love isn't enough if it's not accompanied by respect and commitment. The locksmith bill was $67. Best money I ever spent. Sometimes the most important investment you can make is in keeping the wrong people out of your life rather than trying to make them fit into it. Good locks make good boundaries, and good boundaries make good neighbors, even when those neighbors used to be your spouse. Jessica sends occasional updates about her daughter, who's walking now and apparently has her mother's stubborn independence and her father's engineering mind. I'm glad they're both doing well. I'm gladder still that their well-being isn't my responsibility to maintain or my problem to solve when it's threatened. The pregnancy test is long gone, thrown away with other reminders of conversations I didn't need to have and problems I didn't need to solve. The divorce papers are filed away with other important documents that mark significant transitions in adult life. Both represented endings that needed to happen before better beginnings could start. I helped her learn that actions have consequences and that other people aren't obligated to cushion those consequences when they become uncomfortable. I helped her understand that divorce means the end of spousal obligations, not just marital benefits. I helped her develop independence instead of dependence, resilience instead of entitlement. I helped her learn the difference between wanting help and deserving help, and between asking for assistance and demanding it. Most importantly, I helped myself learn that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice and that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their poor choices. You can wish someone well while refusing to participate in their chaos. You can care about someone's well-being while protecting your own boundaries. You can be kind without being convenient. The locks are still changed, they'll stay that way. Not because I'm afraid of Jessica returning, but because I've learned the value of controlling who has access to my peace of mind. Good locks don't just keep unwanted visitors out, they remind you that your home is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a hotel for people working through their relationship problems. If you're facing a similar situation, remember that kindness doesn't require convenience and compassion doesn't require sacrifice. Help people who want to be helped, not people who want to be rescued. Support people who are building solutions, not people who are avoiding consequences. Love people who choose you consistently, not people who choose you desperately. Change your locks if you need to, both literally and figuratively. Some doors are meant to be closed, and some people are meant to figure out their own way home. The months following Jessica's final departure taught me lessons I hadn't known I needed to learn. Silence, I discovered, has its own weight, not the heavy kind that presses down on your chest during sleepless nights, but the substantial kind that fills spaces previously occupied by chaos. My house began to breathe differently, settling into rhythms that belonged entirely to me. I established new routines with the deliberate care of someone learning to walk after an injury. Coffee at 6:30, prepared in a French press that Jessica had called pretentious but I found meditative. The newspaper spread across a kitchen table that no longer needed to accommodate someone else's schedule or preferences. Breakfast eaten slowly, without the background tension of unspoken grievances or the anticipation of another day spent managing someone else's emotional weather. Work became a refuge rather than an escape. My accounting practice had always been steady, built on relationships with small business owners who valued precision over flash. During my marriage, I'd maintained professional boundaries carefully, keeping personal problems from affecting client relationships. Now I found myself investing more energy in growing the practice, taking on projects I'd previously declined because they required evening work that might conflict with Jessica's social calendar. Mrs. Rodriguez owned 3 Mexican restaurants in the Portland area and had been struggling with inventory management for years. Her previous accountant had handled the basics but hadn't offered strategic guidance about cost control or expansion planning. I spent 2 weeks analyzing her operations, identifying inefficiencies, and developing systems that could scale with her ambitions. The work required late nights and weekend visits to her restaurants, time I now had available without needing to negotiate or apologize. The project was successful enough that Mrs. Rodriguez referred me to other restaurant owners in her network. Within 6 months, I'd developed expertise in hospitality accounting that differentiated my practice from larger firms that treated every client like a variation on the same theme. I hired an assistant, upgraded our office technology, and began planning expansion into advisory services beyond traditional bookkeeping. Professional growth provided structure for personal healing. Each small business success reminded me that competence and reliability had value, that the methodical approach Jessica had dismissed as boring actually solved problems and built trust. I wasn't transforming myself to prove anything to anyone. I was simply allowing natural abilities to flourish without the constant need to balance them against someone else's competing priorities. My social life required more conscious reconstruction. During our marriage, Jessica had managed most of our friendships, particularly the couples we spent time with regularly. She had a talent for organizing dinner parties and group activities that made our house feel like a social hub. Without her initiative, many of those relationships had quietly faded, revealing how much they depended on her energy rather than genuine mutual connection. I began accepting invitations I'd previously declined because they conflicted with Jessica's plans or preferences. My college roommate Brad had been hosting monthly poker games for years, always extending invitations I'd politely refused because Jessica found poker juvenile and the participants unsophisticated. The first game I attended felt awkward, like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly, but by the third month I'd remembered why I'd enjoyed Brad's company enough to room with him for 2 years. The poker group consisted of 6 men in their 30s, all dealing with various stages of career building and relationship management. We played for small stakes and talked about everything except our personal problems until the beer and late hour made honesty easier than deflection. Nobody offered advice unless asked, nobody judged circumstances they hadn't experienced, and nobody expected deeper friendship than showing up consistently and playing cards honestly. Brad worked in construction management and had been married to the same woman for 8 years. He understood relationship complexity without needing to dissect it. Tom was recently divorced and dating with the enthusiasm of someone who'd forgotten how much he enjoyed female company. Mike had never married and seemed content with arrangements that didn't require long-term planning. The diversity of their approaches to personal life reminded me that successful men navigated relationships differently, that my preference for stability and commitment wasn't universally shared or necessarily superior. These friendships operated on principles I'd forgotten during my marriage. Mutual respect without emotional labor, shared activities without shared obligations, support without sacrifice. The men in this group would help each other move furniture or provide a ride to the airport, but nobody expected anyone else to solve their personal problems or validate their life choices. It was friendship stripped down to its essential components, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. I also began exploring interests that had been dormant during my marriage. Jessica had never enjoyed hiking, finding outdoor activities uncomfortable and inconvenient. She preferred cultural events that provided opportunities for social interaction and required appropriate attire. I'd accommodated her preferences so completely that I'd nearly forgotten my own enjoyment of solitary time in natural settings. Oregon's hiking trails became my Saturday morning routine. I started with easy day hikes close to Portland, reacquainting myself with the rhythm of walking long distances without destination deadlines. The silence of forests felt different from the silence of my house. Outdoor quiet was full of life continuing around you, while indoor quiet was full of life waiting to be chosen. Both had value, but hiking silence reminded me that the world was larger than my personal circumstances. I gradually increased distance and difficulty, investing in proper equipment and planning overnight trips to areas that required more commitment than day hikes. Backpacking demanded preparation and self-reliance in ways that appealed to my natural planning instincts. Route selection, weather monitoring, equipment selection, and food planning all required the kind of systematic thinking I'd applied professionally but had never used recreationally. My first solo overnight trip was to Mirror Lake, a moderate hike that could be completed safely by someone with basic outdoor skills. I carried more equipment than necessary, prepared for conditions that were unlikely to occur, and reached the campsite 2 hours before sunset with a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or appreciation. Setting up camp, preparing dinner over a portable stove, and sleeping under stars that weren't visible from Portland reminded me that satisfaction could be entirely self-generated. These hiking trips became monthly expeditions that provided both physical exercise and mental space for processing changes in my life. The combination of moderate physical challenge and extended solitude created conditions where thoughts could settle naturally without forced analysis or premature conclusions. I wasn't trying to forget Jessica or our marriage. I was simply allowing those experiences to find appropriate places in a life that was expanding beyond them. Dating wasn't something I approached systematically until almost a year after the divorce was finalized. Friends had occasionally suggested introductions or group activities where I might meet available women, but I'd politely declined until I felt confident that loneliness wasn't motivating romantic interest. I'd observed too many recently divorced people pursue relationships as antidotes to isolation rather than expressions of genuine connection, usually with results that complicated their healing rather than advancing it. When I did begin dating, I approached it with the same deliberate methodology I applied to other online dating seemed efficient and allowed for screening based on fundamental compatibility before investing time in face-to-face meetings. I created a profile that accurately represented my interests and lifestyle without trying to present myself as more adventurous or socially dynamic than I actually was. Honesty seemed more likely to attract women who would appreciate my actual personality than strategic marketing designed to cast a wider net. My first serious relationship post-divorce was with Amanda, a veterinarian who owned a practice specializing in large animals. She was 34, had never married, and lived on a small farm outside Portland, where she kept horses and goats primarily for her own enjoyment rather than commercial purposes. We met through a hiking group and discovered shared appreciation for outdoor activities and small business management challenges. Amanda had the kind of practical competence I found deeply attractive. She could diagnose illness in animals, repair farm equipment, and manage complex surgical procedures with the same calm focus she brought to planning weekend camping trips. She approached problems systematically, made decisions based on available evidence, and followed through on commitments without requiring external validation or encouragement. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately. We spent time together because we enjoyed each other's company, not because either of us needed to avoid being alone. Weekend activities included hiking, camping, and occasional dinners at restaurants we both wanted to try. We didn't rush toward milestones or discuss long-term plans until we'd established patterns of compatibility that suggested such conversations would be productive rather than theoretical. Amanda understood professional demands because her veterinary practice required irregular hours and emergency availability. She didn't interpret my late nights during tax season as neglect or lack of interest. She appreciated my systematic approach to financial planning because she managed similar responsibilities for her own business. We could discuss practical matters like insurance coverage and retirement planning without one person feeling bored or the other feeling criticized for being too focused on mundane details. The relationship lasted 18 months and ended amicably when Amanda received an opportunity to join a veterinary practice in Montana that specialized in wildlife rehabilitation. The position represented a career advancement she'd been working toward for years, and the timing coincided with her desire to relocate closer to family members who were aging and needed more support. We discussed the possibility of long-distance continuation or my relocating to Montana, but both options required sacrifices that neither of us felt obligated to make for a relationship that was satisfying rather than essential. Amanda's departure taught me important lessons about healthy relationships that my marriage to Jessica had obscured. Compatible people could enjoy each other's company without becoming emotionally dependent. Relationships could end without betrayal or blame when circumstances changed in ways that made continuation impractical. Love didn't always require sacrifice, and sacrifice didn't always demonstrate love. My friendship with Amanda continued after her move to Montana. We exchanged occasional messages about professional developments and personal milestones, maintained connection without expectation or obligation. She'd found professional fulfillment and personal happiness in her new location, and I felt genuinely pleased about her success without any sense of loss or regret about our relationship's conclusion. The contrast with my marriage to Jessica was instructive. Healthy relationships enhanced individual lives rather than replacing them. Partners supported each other's goals rather than competing for priority. Commitment meant choosing to build something together while maintaining individual identity and autonomy. Dependency and devotion were different concepts that required different responses. I began dating other women with clearer understanding of what I was seeking and what I could offer. Sarah was a teacher who shared my appreciation for outdoor activities and financial responsibility. We dated for several months before discovering that our long-term goals regarding children weren't compatible. She wanted a large family within the next few years, while I was uncertain about parenthood and unwilling to make commitments based on speculation about future desires. The conversation about children was difficult but necessary. Sarah deserved a partner who enthusiastically shared her family planning goals, not someone who was merely willing to accommodate them. I deserved a relationship where fundamental life decisions felt like mutual choices rather than compromises required to maintain connection. We ended the relationship with mutual respect and appreciation for the honesty that prevented us from investing additional time in incompatible futures. These dating experiences taught me that compatibility was more complex than attraction or shared interests. Long-term relationships required alignment on fundamental values, life goals, and approaches to problem solving. Physical chemistry and emotional connection were necessary but insufficient for sustainable partnership. The systematic approach that served me well professionally was equally valuable for evaluating romantic relationships. During this period of personal growth, I occasionally wondered about Jessica's situation in Denver. Mutual friends provided occasional updates that I neither sought nor discouraged. Her relationship with Marcus had apparently been turbulent from the beginning, characterized by dramatic reconciliations and equally dramatic separations. They'd broken up and reunited multiple times before the final separation that sent Jessica back to Portland. I felt neither satisfaction nor concern about Jessica's relationship difficulties. Her choices had led to predictable consequences, but those consequences belonged to her rather than to me. I'd learned to distinguish between caring about someone's well-being and feeling responsible for their happiness. Jessica deserved to find stability and contentment, but achieving those goals was her responsibility rather than my concern. The information about Jessica's pregnancy had initially surprised me, though in retrospect it seemed consistent with her pattern of making major life decisions impulsively rather than strategically. Pregnancy represented a permanent commitment that couldn't be reversed when circumstances changed or better options appeared. For someone who'd struggled with long-term thinking throughout our marriage, parenthood would require adaptability I wasn't certain she possessed. My decision to refuse Jessica's request for assistance had been difficult but necessary. Helping her would have required me to resume responsibility for problems I hadn't created and consequences I couldn't control. It would have sent a message that our divorce was negotiable rather than final, that boundaries I'd established could be crossed when circumstances became difficult enough. More importantly, helping Jessica would have prevented her from developing independence and self-reliance she needed for successful single parenthood. Enabling her dependence on me would have delayed her learning to manage challenges on her own. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do for someone is refuse to help them in ways that prevent their growth. I'd learned these lessons through my own experience of building a life that didn't depend on anyone else's participation or approval. The months after Jessica's departure had been challenging but ultimately liberating. I discovered that loneliness and solitude were different experiences, that independence and isolation weren't synonymous, that self-reliance was a skill that could be developed like any other competency. My house had become a home that reflected my preferences rather than accommodating someone else's. The furniture was arranged for my comfort, the temperature set according to my preferences, the schedule organized around my priorities. These might seem like trivial freedoms, but their cumulative effect was profound. I'd forgotten how much energy I'd been spending on negotiation and compromise until that energy was available for other purposes. I'd also rediscovered aspects of my personality that had been dormant during my marriage. I was naturally more introverted than Jessica, preferring smaller gatherings and deeper conversations to large parties and networking events. I enjoyed routine and predictability more than novelty and spontaneity. I approached problems methodically rather than intuitively, preferring analysis to improvisation. These characteristics hadn't been flaws that needed correction, as Jessica had sometimes suggested. They were preferences that contributed to my effectiveness and satisfaction when I was free to express them. The right partner would appreciate these qualities rather than trying to modify them. Compatibility meant finding someone whose natural inclinations complemented rather than conflicted with my own. Professional success continued to provide both financial security and personal satisfaction. My accounting practice had grown to the point where I needed additional staff and larger office space. I'd hired 2 junior accountants and was considering adding a bookkeeper to handle routine client maintenance while I focused on advisory services and business development. The restaurant clients who'd formed the foundation of my practice expansion had introduced me to other hospitality business owners. I'd developed expertise in inventory management, labor cost analysis, and franchise accounting that was rare among practitioners in the Portland market. This specialization allowed me to charge premium rates while providing value that justified the cost difference. I'd also begun teaching evening classes at Portland Community College, sharing practical business accounting knowledge with small business owners who couldn't afford full-time professional services. The teaching provided supplemental income and community connection while allowing me to give back to entrepreneurs who reminded me of my early clients. The combination of growing my own practice and helping others build theirs created professional satisfaction that extended beyond financial metrics. Financial independence had always been important to me, but it gained additional significance after experiencing divorce. I'd learned that economic security provided options that weren't available to people who depended on others for basic needs. Jessica's financial vulnerability after her relationship with Marcus ended had contributed to her desperation when she'd sought my assistance. Self-reliance wasn't just practical, it was protective. I'd increased my retirement contributions, paid down my mortgage ahead of schedule, and built emergency savings that could support my lifestyle for over a year without earned income. These weren't preparations for expected disasters but investments in peace of mind. Financial stability allowed me to make relationship decisions based on genuine compatibility rather than economic necessity. The house had appreciated significantly since I'd purchased it, and the neighborhood had become increasingly desirable as Portland's population grew. I'd considered selling and moving to a smaller place, but decided that the space and established community connections were worth more than the potential profit from downsizing. Home ownership provided stability and control that renting couldn't match. I'd also made improvements to the house that reflected my preferences rather than attempting to maximize resale value. The basement had been converted into a home office with built-in shelving and upgraded electrical systems to support business equipment. The backyard had been landscaped with native plants that required minimal maintenance while providing privacy and seasonal interest. These changes weren't dramatic, but they represented ownership in ways that extended beyond legal title. I was building something that belonged entirely to me, that reflected my values and supported my goals. The house was becoming a foundation for whatever life I chose to build rather than a shelter from circumstances I couldn't control. My relationship with my family had also evolved during this period of personal growth. My parents had been supportive but not intrusive during the divorce, offering assistance without trying to manage outcomes. They'd never been particularly fond of Jessica, though they'd maintained cordial relationships while respecting my marital choices. Her departure had disappointed but not surprised them. My brother Tom lived in Seattle with his wife and 2 young children. We'd maintained regular contact throughout my marriage, but our conversations had often been constrained by my need to avoid discussing marital problems that might reflect poorly on Jessica. Without that constraint, our relationship had become more honest and relaxed. Tom had been through his own relationship challenges before meeting his wife, and he understood the complexity of building sustainable partnerships. He'd offered perspective without advice, support without judgment. His marriage provided an example of successful long-term commitment without serving as a model I needed to replicate exactly. My sister lived in California and had chosen to remain single throughout her 30s, focusing on a demanding career in environmental law. She'd been skeptical of my marriage to Jessica from the beginning, though she'd kept her concerns private until after the divorce was finalized. Her independence and professional success reminded me that fulfilling lives could take many different forms. These family relationships provided continuity and perspective that helped me navigate personal changes without losing sight of fundamental values. I came from people who believed in hard work, personal responsibility, and treating others with respect even when they disappointed you. These principles had guided me through divorce and continued to shape my approach to rebuilding. The question of future marriage required careful consideration. I wasn't opposed to remarrying if I found someone with whom long-term partnership seemed beneficial for both of us, but I was no longer willing to pursue marriage as a goal in itself or accept partnership that required significant sacrifice of individual autonomy. Future relationships would need to enhance rather than replace the life I'd built independently. I'd learned that I could be happy alone, which meant that choosing to be with someone would represent genuine preference rather than fear of solitude. This perspective would allow me to evaluate potential partners more objectively, without the desperation or compromise that had characterized some of my earlier relationship decisions. I'd also learned that marriage required active commitment from both partners rather than passive assumption that love would overcome all obstacles. Successful partnerships demanded ongoing negotiation, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for outcomes. These requirements weren't romantic, but they were realistic. The lessons learned from my marriage to Jessica and its aftermath had been expensive but valuable. I'd discovered that enabling someone's poor decisions helped neither of you. That boundaries were protective rather than punitive. That independence was a strength rather than a limitation. That methodical approaches to major life decisions were more reliable than intuitive ones. I'd also learned that personal growth required accepting responsibility for your own happiness rather than expecting others to provide it. That solitude and loneliness were different experiences. That self-reliance was a skill that could be developed through practice. That peaceful lives were possible for people willing to make difficult decisions when necessary. The house where Jessica had once lived was now simply my house, free of associations that had once made ordinary rooms feel complicated. The kitchen where she'd once prepared meals was now a place where I cooked food I enjoyed eating. The bedroom where we'd once shared intimacy was now a space designed entirely for my comfort and rest. This transformation hadn't required deliberate forgetting or conscious effort to eliminate reminders. Time and new experiences had naturally displaced old associations. The space had filled with memories and meanings that belonged to my current life rather than my previous marriage. Home had become a foundation for moving forward rather than a shrine to what had ended. Looking ahead, I could imagine sharing this space with someone whose presence would enhance rather than complicate the peace I'd built. The right person would appreciate the life I'd created while bringing elements that made it richer rather than more chaotic. Partnership would mean addition rather than replacement. But if that person never appeared, I'd discovered that solitary life had its own satisfactions. Professional growth, meaningful friendships, family relationships, outdoor adventures, and personal projects provided fulfillment that didn't require romantic validation. I was building a life that was complete in itself rather than waiting for someone else to make it whole. The locks on my doors had become symbols of something larger than home security. They represented the right to choose who had access to my space, my time, and my energy. They reminded me that boundaries were necessary for healthy relationships rather than barriers to them. Good locks kept out people who belonged elsewhere while welcoming those who belonged inside. Jessica's unexpected return and my decision to refuse her assistance had tested these principles under pressure. The outcome had confirmed that self-protection and compassion weren't contradictory, that helping someone sometimes meant refusing to help them, that kindness didn't require convenience. I'd proven to myself that I could maintain boundaries even when doing so was emotionally difficult, that I could distinguish between someone else's emergency and my own responsibility, that I could care about someone's well-being without feeling obligated to ensure it personally. These lessons extended beyond romantic relationships to all areas of life. Professional boundaries protected both client relationships and personal time. Family boundaries allowed for closeness without obligation. Friendship boundaries ensured mutual respect without exploitation. The man who'd once allowed Jessica to use our marriage as a safety net while exploring other options had learned to recognize manipulation disguised as need. I'd developed immunity to emotional appeals that sought to override rational boundaries. I'd learned to trust my judgment even when others disagreed with my decisions. This growth hadn't made me cynical or suspicious. I remained open to genuine connection and legitimate requests for assistance. But I'd learned to distinguish between people who wanted help solving problems and people who wanted others to solve problems for them. Between those who needed temporary support and those who expected permanent rescue. The difference was often subtle but always significant. People who wanted genuine help accepted boundaries, contributed to solutions, and expressed appreciation rather than entitlement. People who expected rescue resented limitations, avoided responsibility, and demanded assistance rather than requesting it. Jessica's behavior during her crisis had clearly placed her in the second category. Her expectation that I would provide housing and support despite our divorce revealed fundamental misunderstanding about adult relationships and personal responsibility. Her anger when I'd refused demonstrated that she'd viewed my assistance as obligation rather than generosity. The months that followed had apparently taught her lessons she'd needed to learn about independence and self-reliance. According to the limited information I'd received, she'd found employment, housing, and childcare arrangements without depending on ex-husband charity. She'd discovered that crisis could motivate growth when enabling wasn't available. This outcome validated my decision to refuse assistance that would have delayed her development of necessary life skills. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is allow them to experience consequences that teach important lessons. Protection from all difficulty prevented learning that was essential for personal growth. I'd applied similar principles to my own life, choosing challenges that promoted growth rather than avoiding all discomfort. Divorce had been difficult but ultimately beneficial. Building an independent life had required effort but provided satisfaction that dependence never could. Learning to evaluate relationships objectively had been emotionally challenging but practically valuable. The future held possibilities I was prepared to evaluate carefully rather than pursue desperately. Professional opportunities would be assessed based on their potential to provide growth and satisfaction rather than just increased income. Relationship opportunities would be considered for their capacity to enhance rather than complicate the life I'd built. I'd learned that good decisions were usually boring decisions, that dramatic choices often reflected poor planning rather than exceptional circumstances, That sustainable happiness came from consistent daily practices rather than. The hiking trips had become more ambitious as my experience and confidence grew. The accounting practice continued expanding through referrals from satisfied clients who appreciated reliable service more than flashy marketing. Amanda and I maintained occasional contact, sharing updates about professional developments and personal milestones. Her success in Montana confirmed that compatible people could separate amicably when circumstances required it. Our relationship had been healthy enough to survive its own conclusion. These elements combined to create a life that was stable without being stagnant, independent without being isolated, open to new experiences without being chaotic. I built something that belonged entirely to me while remaining available for sharing with someone who could appreciate and contribute to what already existed. The keys to my house remained mine alone, but they weren't held defensively. They represented choice rather than fear, standards rather than suspicion. The right person would understand that earning access was a privilege that came with responsibilities rather than an entitlement that came with need. Change would come when it enhanced rather than disrupted the foundation I'd built. Growth would continue through choices that aligned with demonstrated values rather than reactions to external pressure. The future would unfold according to principles that had proven themselves through testing rather than hopes that had never been examined. The house where Jessica had once expected shelter had become a home that sheltered only those who belonged there. The man who'd once provided safety nets for people who didn't appreciate them had learned to offer support only to those who could distinguish between assistance and dependence. These weren't bitter lessons but practical ones. They'd been learned through experience rather than theory, tested under pressure rather than assumed in comfort. They'd proven themselves reliable guides for building relationships that enhanced rather than complicated the life I'd chosen to create. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to apply these principles, new chances to choose growth over security, new possibilities for connection with people who shared similar values. But today was complete in itself, requiring nothing external to make it satisfactory, depending on no one else's choices to make it worthwhile. The locks remained changed, the boundaries remained clear, and the future remained open to possibilities worth pursuing. 3 years passed before I heard Jessica's name again in any meaningful context. The mention came from an unexpected source during a routine business meeting. I was consulting with a new client, a boutique marketing firm downtown, when their creative director mentioned they'd recently hired someone who'd relocated from Denver with impressive nonprofit experience. The creative director, Michelle, was describing their newest team member's background when she mentioned the name Jessica Chen. My ex-wife had apparently reclaimed her maiden name after our divorce and built a respectable career in nonprofit marketing. According to Michelle, Jessica had managed several successful fundraising campaigns for children's charities in Colorado before deciding to return to Portland for fame. I felt neither surprise nor concern hearing this information. Jessica had always possessed talent for marketing and communications. Her ability to connect with people and articulate compelling narratives had served her well professionally, even when those same skills had complicated our personal relationship. That she'd found career success wasn't unexpected, and that she'd returned to Portland made practical sense given her family connections here. Michelle continued explaining their decision to hire Jessica, praising her portfolio and references from previous employers. The conversation moved quickly to other topics related to their accounting needs, and Jessica's employment became simply another data point in a business discussion. I maintained professional focus on the client's requirements without revealing any personal connection to their new employee. Later that evening, I considered whether Jessica's return to Portland would affect my life in any meaningful way. 3 years of personal growth and professional success had created substantial distance from our shared history. I'd built relationships, career momentum, and daily routines that existed independently of her presence or absence in the same city. Her proximity seemed unlikely to generate complications unless I allowed it to. Portland was large enough for 2 people to live separate lives without frequent accidental encounters. Our social circles had diverged during our marriage and remained distinct after our divorce. The professional communities we worked within rarely overlapped. The geographic areas where we lived and spent recreational time were different. Coexistence without interaction seemed entirely feasible. I'd also developed sufficient emotional distance from our relationship that seeing Jessica occasionally wouldn't trigger significant stress or nostalgia. The man who'd felt devastated by her betrayal and abandonment had evolved into someone who viewed those experiences as learning opportunities rather than ongoing wounds. Time and positive experiences had provided perspective that made past hurts feel remote and manageable. Several months after learning of Jessica's return, I encountered her directly for the first time since our coffee shop meeting 3 years earlier. The setting was a community fundraising event for the Oregon Food Bank, an annual gathering that attracted professionals from various industries who supported hunger relief efforts. I'd attended for 2 years running, both to support a worthy cause and to network with potential clients in the nonprofit sector. Jessica was there representing her new employer, staffing in engaging attendees about upcoming charity initiatives. She looked professionally polished and personally content, all displaying the confident energy I remembered from early in our relationship. She was speaking animatedly with a small group about innovative fundraising strategies, clearly comfortable in her expertise and enthusiastic about her work. Our eyes met briefly across the room, a moment of recognition that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before we both looked away and continued our respective conversations. Neither of us approached the other or made gestures indicating desire for interaction. We navigated the event carefully, maintaining appropriate distance while fulfilling our professional obligations to be present and engaged. I felt no impulse to initiate contact or curiosity about her personal circumstances. She appeared healthy and professionally successful, which satisfied any residual concern about her well-being without creating desire for deeper knowledge. We were former spouses who'd become strangers, sharing space at a public event without sharing meaning or connection. The fundraising event concluded without further interaction between us. I'd accomplished my networking goals and contributed to an organization I supported. Jessica had apparently done the same for her employer. We'd proven that proximity didn't require engagement, that shared spaces could accommodate people with shared history without generating drama or complication. This encounter established a pattern that continued over the following months. Portland's professional community occasionally brought us to the same events or meetings. We maintained polite distance, acknowledging each other's presence without pursuing conversation. These interactions felt neither awkward nor meaningful, simply practical navigation of overlapping professional requirements. I occasionally heard updates about Jessica through mutual professional contacts, the kind of indirect information that circulates naturally in interconnected business communities. She'd apparently purchased a small house in southeast Portland. Her daughter was enrolled in a well-regarded preschool. She'd received recognition for her work on a successful capital campaign for a local children's hospital. These updates reached me without my seeking them and left without my retaining them. Jessica's life was proceeding successfully according to her own choices, and her achievements were her own, her challenges were her own, and her future was her own to determine. I felt neither investment in her success nor concern about her difficulties. My own life continued evolving in directions that brought satisfaction and growth. The accounting practice had expanded to include 3 full-time employees and was considering a second office location to serve clients in Washington County. I'd been invited to join the board of directors for a local business development nonprofit, a position that would allow me to contribute expertise while expanding my professional network. Personally, I'd begun a relationship with Rachel, a nurse practitioner who shared my appreciation for outdoor activities and financial responsibility. We'd met through the hiking club I'd joined 2 years earlier and had been dating for 8 months with increasing seriousness about long-term potential. Rachel was divorced with 1 teenage son, bringing experience with blended family dynamics and realistic expectations about adult relationships. Our relationship progressed deliberately, built on shared values and compatible lifestyles rather than passionate intensity or urgent timelines. We enjoyed each other's company consistently, supported each other's professional goals, and navigated disagreements with mutual respect and compromise. The foundation felt solid enough to consider deeper commitment when both of us felt ready for that progression. Rachel knew about my previous marriage and divorce without needing extensive details or emotional processing. She understood that past relationships provided learning experiences that informed present choices. Her own divorce had taught her similar lessons about boundaries, communication, and the importance of maintaining individual identity within partnership. We discussed future possibilities openly but without pressure. Marriage might eventually make sense if our relationship continued developing positively. Combining households could provide practical benefits while allowing us to build something together. But neither of us felt urgency about formalizing arrangements that were already working well. This approach to relationship building reflected lessons learned from my marriage to Jessica. Compatibility required demonstration over time rather than assumption based on attraction. Successful partnerships needed aligned values, complementary strengths, and shared commitment to growth. Love was necessary but insufficient without respect, trust, and practical cooperation. 6 months into this developing relationship with Rachel, an unexpected development tested my emotional distance from Jessica and our shared history. Rachel mentioned during a casual conversation that she'd encountered a former colleague at the hospital who'd mentioned working with someone named Jessica Chen on a fundraising committee for pediatric cancer research. The colleague had apparently spoken positively about Jessica's professional competence and personal warmth. According to this second-hand account, Jessica was actively involved in several charitable organizations and had developed a reputation for innovative approaches to donor engagement. She was also apparently raising her daughter as a single mother while building her career, balancing responsibilities that required considerable skill and dedication. Rachel's mention of this information was casual, without awareness of any connection to my personal history. I listened without revealing that connection, allowing the conversation to move naturally to other topics. But the information stirred unexpected reactions that required private processing. Learning about Jessica's apparent success as both a professional and a parent generated complex emotions. Pride that she'd developed capabilities I'd doubted she possessed during our marriage, relief that my decision to refuse assistance during her crisis hadn't prevented her from building stability, validation that people could learn and grow from consequences rather than being permanently damaged by them, but also a subtle sadness that these positive developments had required the end of our marriage to occur. Questions about whether different choices by either of us might have produced different outcomes. Wonder about the person Jessica had become and whether that person might have been compatible with the person I'd become. These reflections weren't nostalgic longing for reunion or regret about decisions made. They were more like curiosity about alternative histories, the kind of wondering that accompanies most major life transitions. I'd moved forward successfully from our marriage, but that didn't eliminate all interest in roads not taken or possibilities not explored. I shared these thoughts with Rachel during a walk the following weekend. Her response demonstrated the emotional maturity that had attracted me to her initially. She listened without defensiveness or jealousy, understanding that past relationships shaped present perspectives without threatening current commitments. She offered observations without advice, support without solutions. Rachel's response helped me recognize that occasional curiosity about Jessica's development was natural rather than concerning. Former spouses who'd shared significant time and experiences would naturally wonder about each other's subsequent lives. Such interest became problematic only when it interfered with present relationships or motivated inappropriate contact. Our conversation also reinforced my appreciation for Rachel's approach to emotional complexity. She could discuss difficult topics without creating drama or demanding reassurance. She understood that healthy adults carried histories that included other relationships, other loves, other losses. Security came from present choices rather than elimination of all references to the past. This discussion marked a subtle but important shift in my relationship with both women. With Jessica, it represented final emotional resolution about our shared issues. I could acknowledge that she'd become someone admirable without regretting that we hadn't remained together to witness her growth. With Rachel, it demonstrated the kind of emotional honesty that strong relationships required and could tolerate. The following months brought several significant developments that further clarified my priorities and commitments. Rachel and I decided to move in together, combining our households in a way that honored both our needs for independence and our desire for deeper partnership. Her teenage son adapted well to the changes, appreciating additional stability while maintaining appropriate boundaries with a parental figure who wasn't trying to replace his father. Professionally, I'd been offered an opportunity to acquire a competing accounting practice whose owner was retiring. The merger would nearly double my client base while requiring significant financial investment and management restructuring. The decision demanded careful analysis of risks and opportunities, exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd developed through previous challenges. These developments required focus and energy that left little attention for peripheral concerns. Building a blended family demanded daily attention to communication, logistics, and relationship dynamics. Expanding the business required months of due diligence, negotiation, and integration planning. Present opportunities were too demanding and rewarding to permit much reflection on past relationships. The final encounter with Jessica occurred at a professional conference focused on nonprofit management strategies. I was attending to learn about accounting practices specific to charitable organizations while she was presumably there to develop fundraising expertise. We found ourselves in the same breakout session on financial transparency and donor relations. During the session, Jessica asked several thoughtful questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of nonprofit governance and accountability. Her contributions to group discussions were substantive and well-informed. She appeared confident and knowledgeable, clearly comfortable in professional settings that required expertise and credibility. After the session concluded, we encountered each other in the hallway during a coffee break. For the first time in 3 years, direct conversation seemed unavoidable without appearing deliberately rude. We exchanged brief pleasantries about the conference content and our respective professional interests. Jessica mentioned that she'd heard through mutual contacts that my accounting practice was expanding and congratulated me on that success. I thanked her and reciprocated with acknowledgement of her apparent professional achievements. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes and covered only professional topics, but it felt natural rather than forced or uncomfortable. Neither of us mentioned personal matters, family circumstances, or past relationships. We spoke as professional acquaintances who happened to have shared history, not as former spouses still carrying emotional baggage. The interaction confirmed that we'd both moved forward successfully from our marriage and could coexist professionally without complication. As we prepared to return to our respective conference activities, Jessica paused and said something that provided unexpected closure to our shared history. She mentioned that she'd learned valuable lessons from the difficulties following our divorce, particularly about the importance of independence and personal responsibility. She thanked me for refusing to enable her dependence during her crisis, recognizing that my decision had ultimately helped her develop necessary capabilities. This acknowledgement wasn't apology or explanation, but simple recognition of how consequences had promoted growth. Jessica had learned that self-reliance was essential for successful adult life. That depending on others for basic needs created vulnerability that complicated relationships and delayed maturity. That crisis could motivate positive change when escape routes weren't readily available. I responded that I was glad she'd found stability and success, and that I'd hoped my decision would ultimately prove helpful rather than harmful. We parted with mutual respect and appreciation for lessons learned, roads taken, and growth achieved. The conversation felt like appropriate conclusion to a relationship that had taught both of us important truths about ourselves and adult partnership. Walking back to my conference sessions, I reflected on the journey from that painful evening when Jessica had called me worthless to this moment of mutual respect and separate success. The man who'd felt devastated by betrayal had learned to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. The woman who'd once required constant external support had developed independence and professional competence. Both transformations had required the end of our marriage to occur. Some lessons could only be learned through consequences, some growth only achieved through struggle. Our relationship had served its purpose by teaching us what we needed to know about ourselves, even if that knowledge made continuing together impossible. The conference concluded with new professional insights and renewed appreciation for the life I'd built since our divorce. Rachel was waiting at home with dinner plans and updates about her son's college applications. The accounting practice acquisition was proceeding smoothly toward a closing date that would mark another significant milestone in professional growth. These present realities felt substantial and rewarding in ways that past regrets never could. I'd learned to distinguish between lessons that required preservation and pain that required release. Jessica had been an important teacher in my life, but she was no longer a significant presence in it. The house where she'd once expected shelter was now home to people who'd chosen to be there through mutual commitment rather than desperate need. The man who'd once provided safety nets for people who didn't appreciate them now offered support only to those who could distinguish between assistance and dependence. The locks remained changed, but they no longer symbolized protection from specific threats. They represented choice, standards, and the right to determine who had access to the life I'd built. Good boundaries made good relationships possible by ensuring that connection was voluntary rather than assumed. Jessica's story had ended happily but separately from mine. That outcome represented success for both of us, proof that people could learn from mistakes and build better lives through their own efforts. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was allow them to discover their own strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.